Government business, order of the day number 9, National Broadband Network Companies Amendment, Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
And I call the member for Riverina in continuation.
Thank you, Speaker. This bill is totally a political one in nature. It is very much formed to be a wedge, a political wedge, to put privatisation on the agenda for the 2025 election. That's what Labor's doing. When Labor introduced its legislation establishing the National Broadband Network, it specifically said and contemplated a situation in which it could be sold, and the Act outlines a stage process under which the government's NBN co-stake can be sold down. Now, let's hear what some key stakeholders have had to say about this latest situation. Ziggy Sosowski, former chair of NBN, former chief executive of Telstra and Optus. The decision to hold NBN in government ownership is fine for the short term, say this decade, but beyond that horizon, why do it? It feels like the ban on nuclear power. Why do it? Paul Budd, telecommunications industry analyst, even if sold at the most recent valuation of $20 billion, that would still represent an enormous loss for taxpayers and would be a political disaster. And finding a buyer, even from overseas, would be difficult. And I do have a bit of a problem sometimes with overseas buyers, particularly for our strategic national assets. And I can well recall in the first year of the Abbott government when there was a proposal put forward to sell off the GrainCorp. And indeed Archer Daniels Midland, an American-owned company, which had a less than desirable track record in some of its corporate doings in the US, was going to buy what essentially was all the silos and all the infrastructure that my late father Lance and all the other wheat growers had paid for many times over. And what would that do to Australia? Well, it would determine how much wheat, how much grain we would grow, and particularly it would determine the price. And heavily subsidised US wheat growers would get an advantage over Australian wheat growers who grow the best hard wheat in the world. And our wheat growers would be put at a disadvantage. And we don't need that, particularly when Canada produces a lot of wheat, particularly when the world markets are crying out for our wheat. Why should the price of our wheat be determined around a boardroom table in Illinois, America? It's just not right, and I stood against it then, and I know that we made the right decision. And when it came to foreign investment, we changed the rules when we came to government around foreign investment, and particularly agricultural assets, particularly that. Now, with this particular bill, I must say we do have an Americanisation of the NBN. Recently I got fibre to the premises at my home and was horrified. I didn't actually ask for it. Even when I was Deputy Prime Minister, I didn't want to get forward in the queue. I wanted to wait my turn. And quite frankly, ADSL2 was working just fine and had worked just fine, even when I ran a small business from home. A rather successful media company, I might say. But I do digress, Member for Solomon. I was alarmed to see FTTC on the paperwork for the NBN, fibre to the curb, CURB. I mean, this is Australia. Curb, which is the gutter along the sideway, call it what you like, along the bitumen, out the front of your house, out on the street, is KERB. And yet we just somehow we just get all this Americanisation just thrust upon us, and I appreciate they're our closest security partner, as they should be, and all the rest. But you know, when NBN and other companies are doing these sorts of programs and putting in place these sorts of glossy brochures, here's a tip: get it right, spell it right, spell it the Australian English version, not the one from America. Now, as I said, this is a stunt from a desperate and failing government. It very much is. They want privatisation to be on the agenda for The next scare campaign, they did so in 2016. Who will ever forget the bombardment of advertisements, particularly to younger families, about Medi-Scare? And it worked a treat, unfortunately, but they seem to forget their own record, their own shoddy record of privatisation. In the 1990s, the Treasurer's own idol, Prime Minister Paul Keating, privatised not only Qantas but also the Commonwealth Bank. Now, you could argue that, well, governments aren't there to run banks and aren't there to run airlines, and that may well be the case. But this government can't then try to bring on these scare campaigns at the 11th hour, just prior to an election, so that they then allege, and they will, wait for it, that under the new provisions that people will be paying more for the internet. People will be paying more to download and upload data. And this, let me tell you, is what is coming. Now, our position as the coalition will be opposing the bill. Our position is that we're not proposing a sale. We are very much economic rationalists and economic adults, unlike those opposite. They want to just politicise everything, as they always do. We will take a responsible approach, and we'll do it in a way that is best for the consumer, best for the Australian public. Now, at a time when Australians need help desperately with the cost of living crisis, a cost of living crisis brought about under Labor, a cost of living crisis that Labor didn't even acknowledge or recognise until after the voice vote was lost. They cared way more about a divisive referendum that cost $450 million and did nothing but create divisions within this country. They were not talking about cost of living then. They seem to have caught up now, but sometimes it's too little too late. And they're running around scaring everybody with proposals such as this, scaring everybody, saying that they will manage the economy when in fact they have not. We'll take this bill in the usual way. This is a farcical approach from the Albanese government. And, you know, you look at their record in so many times, in so many aspects. And the Prime Minister has mentioned NBN only 6 times in the Parliament this year, most recently as the 3rd of July. And that was quite some time ago, quite some months ago. And the 6th time was about how NBN Sky Muster, the NBN satellite, was helping Indigenous communities, which was on the 13th of February 2024. And then all of a sudden, in the second last week of sittings of the federal parliament for 2024, when who knows when the election is just around the corner, we find ourselves with a debate such as this plonked on the table, and of course the urgency to debate it, the urgency to pass it, the urgency for Labor to pretend as though they're getting on board with the policies that matter to Australians. Well, the policies that matter to Australians are cost of living. The policies that matter to Australians are the price of groceries. The policies that matter to Australians should be around the cost of fuel, because every time people go to the Bowser, they're paying more and more and more. Every time they get their energy bills, they're higher and higher and higher. And that is what the general public are talking about. That's the barbecue stopper. It's not the ownership of broadband, the NBN at the moment. It is making sure that if they are in regional Australia, they have connectivity, that they have mobile phones which actually have service. And I mentioned yesterday about the situation at Ardlethan and Camara, where farmers are being forced to climb silos during times of medical emergencies, and the Grinter family had to do just that, just to get reception, just to get a bar on their phone so that they could make an urgent call because there was a medical crisis. And this is simply not good enough. And when Labor brings out its latest round of mobile phone tower installations and infrastructure, they put them all in Labor electorates. And they came to the election saying they'd be far more transparent and far more accountable and far more honest in their dealings when it came to funding initiatives, particularly in regional Australia. And what did they do? They had a spreadsheet which was all red, all Labor. I say shame on Labor for just that. And all well and good if you're in a Labor seat and got one of the mobile phone towers, but not good enough if you're in a coalition seat, and we hold more regional seats than Labor, and we missed out unfairly, unjustifiably. I don't know how Labor members can come to the dispatch box and come to the microphone and then argue that they are being more accountable when it comes to funding such as that, particularly for regional areas. But this is just another scare campaign. It's just Labor trying to get their house in order prior to the election. Shame on them.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the Assistant Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The creation of the National Broadband Network flowed out of the botched privatisation of Telstra under the Howard government. Telstra was privatised by the Howard government starting in 1997. They're selling off 49% initially and then selling Telstra down into minority public ownership in 2006. That meant that when the Rudd government came to office and called for tenders to build a national broadband network, Telstra, then under majority private ownership, produced an extraordinary document. Asked to show how it might build a national network serving 98% of the population, Telstra turned in a desultory 12-page letter, which wasn't compliant for the requirements at the time. That meant that Telstra had to be removed from the request for proposals process, and then the national broadband network flowed. We can only imagine how much more straightforward the process of building the national broadband network would have been if Telstra had worked constructively with the government in 2008. But it wasn't possible, largely because of the decision that the Howard government had made as to how to privatise Telstra. This bill matters to Australians. It matters to Australians because by keeping the NBN in full government control, we ensure ongoing regulatory oversight of NBN wholesale pricing, keeping broadband affordable for Australians. It's also important because the NBN is crucial national infrastructure. There are cybersecurity and national security imperatives that require strong government oversight and which are best ensured by ongoing government ownership. Any future sale of the national broadband network would be likely to involve foreign ownership, raising serious national security and sovereignty risks. Now, those opposites have argued in their talking points that the bill is unnecessary because no future government would possibly privatise the NBN. That, though, flies in the face of the way in which the coalition has behaved in the past. The sale of Telstra, which deprived the government of leverage to roll out fibre broadband, leading to the national broadband network. The botched privatisation of Medibank Private by the then Abbott government in 2014, which took away an important public-owned competitor to hold private health insurers to account. That then meant that we saw the largest player in private health care move into private hands, taking away any ability of the government to better hold that sector in check. Medibank Private, as Australia's largest private health insurer, then operated very much as you would expect an oligopoly player to operate. We saw under the coalition an NBN submission to increase wholesale prices on their core products by 3% over the CPI. The aim of that was clearly to bolster their income streams in preparation for sale. That move was rejected by Labor. It was rejected by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Labor recognised the risk of a measure which the coalition was putting in place, clearly readying the NBN for a potential sell-off. We've seen a range of prominent economists say that their views on privatisation have shifted because of a series of botched privatisations. In 2016, ACCC Chair Rod Sims said he had been a strong advocate of privatisation for 30 years because he believed it produced enhanced economic efficiency. But he said he now had shifted his views and was, as he said, quote, almost at the point of opposing privatisation because the sales of assets had not been done with the long-term interests of taxpayers. Mr Sims pointed particularly to the sale of the Port of Newcastle and the bundled sale of the ports of Botany and Kembla, clearly done in order to maximise the sale price rather than to maximise long-term competition. Another former chair of the ACCC, Alan Fells, said of privatisation, quote, everyone was only interested in revenue. As he pointed out, the Sydney Airport Corporation was privatised with first rights to bid for a second airport in Sydney, and that effectively led to adverse outcomes for consumers. And we've seen the current ACCC chair, Jenna Cass-Gottlieb, pointing out the dangers of privatisation, again using the example of the ports industry. In a speech a couple of years ago, Jenna Cass-Gottlieb said, quote, Australia's container ports are regional monopolies, and in the absence of appropriate regulation, they can extract monopoly rents from users with no alternatives. Ms Cass-Gottlieb pointed to the Port of Melbourne, privatised in 2017, and noted that the Essential Services Commission of Victoria was tasked with monitoring pricing. In two separate reviews, in 2020 and 2021, the Essential Services Commission found the Port of Melbourne had exercised market power in setting land rents and engaged in significant and sustained non-compliance with the state's pricing order. So successive chairs of the ACCC have pointed out the risk of botched privatisations of the kind that coalition governments seem to favour so much. John Quiggin, economist at the University of Queensland, has pointed to a number of international examples of botched privatisation. The British government's privatisation of the rail network, partially reversed with the renationalisation of rail track under the Blair Labor government. The sale of council homes under Margaret Thatcher, which led to a massive rundown in British social housing. The privatisation of Thames Water, privatised under Prime Minister Thatcher and stripped bare by its private owners. As Professor Quiggin puts it, quote, the simplest explanation is that politicians saw privatisation and private infrastructure as a way to get access to a big bucket of money which could be spent on popular projects without the need to raise taxes. This was a fallacy refuted many times over, but resurrected just as often in zombie form. One of the worst privatisations that history has seen, the sell-off of Chicago's parking meters for $1.1 billion over 75 years. After just 15 years after the sale, the owners had fully recouped their investment plus $500 million and still had 60 years left on the deal. Chicago was left with a situation in which it was paying compensation costs to the new private owners. Every time parades, street maintenance, bike lanes, outdoor seating were put in, then the private owners would need to be paid out. Yet another example in which privatisation has not delivered for citizens. As Clayton Barr noted in a speech in the New South Wales Parliament, the privatisation of the Port of Newcastle was said to have been done by the New South Wales Liberal government with no restriction on shipping container terminals. That was shown to be a complete fabrication. He notes the privatisation of the Land Titles Office, in which the then Liberal government promised that employees would be offered a 4-year protection for their employment. 12 months after that sale, 30% of the workforce was gone, a decision which, according to Mr Barr, cost New South Wales Treasury books more than $100 million each year. He pointed too to the New South Wales privatisation of Ausgrid, in which multi-year protections were said to have been put in place for workers, but in fact the new privatised owners stripped out the profits, sacked the workforce, allowed reliability to decline. Ausgrid workers were left jobless, and the state, according to Mr Barr, ended up losing close to $2 billion every single year. The continued failure of Liberals to understand the way in which privatisation can operate against the interest of consumers, it comes down to their overriding faith in the power of free markets to always do better than the government. Yes, there are certain instances in which privatisations can produce efficiencies, but that judgment needs to be made on a case-by-case basis, based on evidence, not on blind ideology. The privatisation of monopoly assets without appropriate regulation has, in many cases, been disastrous for Australian taxpayers. It has seen Liberal governments place short-term windfall gains ahead of the long-term interest of Australians. The range of the privatisations that we've seen under Liberal governments have returned billions of dollars into government coffers in the short term, but at the cost of tens of billions of dollars to consumers in the long term. A botched privatisation of a monopoly asset is effectively to put a tax on future taxpayers who miss out on the benefits that flow from competition. In the case of NBN, it is difficult to see how you would privatise and have an appropriate system of regulation which would constrain a newly privatised monopoly of that kind. It would then potentially go on to extract monopoly rents from users in the same way in which we've seen happen in the case of ports, in the case of electricity grids, in the case of parking meters. Without appropriate competition, these privatised monopoly assets behave just in the way our economic textbooks would lead us to believe. And so it is important that the House pass this bill because Australia for decades has seen too many examples in which Liberal governments have failed to apply sound economic analysis to privatisation decisions. We know that those opposite are often too hasty in their blind love of markets, too slow to think about the issues of competition which need to be taken into account in any privatisation. A greater role for the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission in considering privatisation decisions may well be warranted in the future to provide a check on any Conservative state or territory government that might look to privatise a public monopoly asset, to do so in a way which was against the interests of consumers. We've seen another example in the case of PEXA, the e-conveyancing monopoly, privatised by state and territory governments, garnering significant revenue in the short term, but at the cost of higher e-conveyancing fees in the long term. And the interoperability reforms, which would allow the e-conveyancing to be a competitive market, have the full support of the Albanese government and are something which state and territory governments should prioritise in order that people buying a home get a better deal. In conclusion, Deputy Speaker, since this is the last sittings block of the parliamentary year, can I acknowledge my staff who've worked with me over the course of the year: Georgia Thompson, Bria Larkspur, Isha Singhal, Angela Fernando, Cal Slater. Iris Eager, Toby Halligan, Meg Thomas, Francis Kitt, Tori Barker, Maria Neal, Felicity Wilkins, Louise Negline, Bronwyn Asquith, Ashish Nair and Nick Terrell. My departmental liaison officers who've served variously in my office through the year: Brooke Gay, Lizzie McAnulty, Joshua Lovett, Hayley Ward, Vijay Murik. And my volunteers, Lily Stowaski and Jeff Robertson, for their help. Each of us in this place benefit from our parties, for those of us who are fortunate to represent major parties, and for me it's Australia's oldest and greatest political party, the Labor Party. And I do want to acknowledge the extraordinary team of volunteers who've helped me through the course of the year and whose help I hope I can count on in next year's election. I also want to thank, finally, the huge support that I get from my wonderful family. Looking forward to spending more time with you over the Christmas break, and apologies in advance for the days out on the hustings in next year's election.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Ford.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. And much as I like the member for Fenner, and much as I could agree with some of his comments, and he went through a litany of privatisations in his contribution, but he forgot to include the myriad of privatisations that have occurred under state Labor governments over the past 30 years. Particularly in Queensland. The only state government in Queensland that's privatised any state assets is the state Labor government. And people should never forget that it was state Labor in Queensland that privatised a myriad of assets, including toll roads, which Queenslanders are now paying for more than ever. So when I listen to the member for Fenner and the other contributions from those opposite, I find it passing strange that their certain or recent conversion to the notion that privatisations are bad quite interesting, because the piece of legislation that we're talking about, Deputy Speaker, is actually a Labor piece of legislation. It's a Labor piece of legislation that was put in place when they created the NBN back in 2011. So I suggest maybe they go and have a discussion with the former Communications Minister, Stephen Conroy, to find out why this was inserted in their own bill in the first place back in 2011. This is nothing more than a political stunt. Nothing more than a political stunt. It's what you do as a government when you are facing difficulties and headwinds in other areas where you don't want to deal with those issues or face up to your shortcomings as a government, because they are myriad and plenty. And as I know the member for Hume at the table could list an extraordinary list of their failures. And we find that the government has an incredible talent for misdirection. We know the Australian people are facing a cost of living crisis. Yet what do we see this government doing? Nothing. Or at best fiddling at the edges to be gracious to them. They are failing the Australian people abysmally. And then they come into this place and introduce a piece of legislation such as this, which is just a pure, pathetic political stunt. And it says everything you need to know about this government. Well, as I said, this was passed back in 2010 when the current Prime Minister was a member of Cabinet. The Prime Minister is so exercised about these couple of clauses in the current legislation to prevent privatisation, why did he not oppose them back in 2010 when this bill was actually passed to create NBN Co? Because he didn't believe it was necessary. They thought it was appropriate. It went through the government's cabinet process to be the law of the land today. This is purely a distraction from their failure to deliver for the Australian people. And it's straight out of Labor's misinformation handbook. Straight out of their misinformation handbook. And it brings to mind, Deputy Speaker, the Mediscare campaign of 2016. It's what they do. It's what the government does. They don't want to talk about their record because they've got no record to hang their hat on, so they find or invent some scare campaign to distract from their lack of contribution and performance to dealing with the issues that are actually facing this country. So we stand here today, we're dealing with an obstinate inflation rate of 3.4%. We stand here today with the average mortgage holder paying $35,000 a year more on their mortgage. We stand here today with people's electricity prices, food and grocery, fuel, transport, energy, all having increased by double digits. And yet what do we see this government doing? Putting into this House a bill that is just a political stunt to divert from their failure to deliver with the cost of living crisis facing everyday Australians. Now, the interesting thing about this bill, Deputy Speaker, is that it actually fails to deal with the nearly 14% increase in NBN prices since October last year. Another impact on people's cost of living that the government is failing to deal with. And when I talk to business across my community, they talk to me about their struggles to pay ever-increasing energy prices, particularly gas. And I used the example earlier today of businesses whose gas prices have gone up 180% in the past 12 months, and they're thinking about closing their doors. But every business I speak to is struggling with energy costs, rental increases, increase in the cost of inputs into their business. And they are very conscious of the fact that Australian families are struggling. And they are trying to work out as a business how they cover their cost increases, yet keep prices at a level that are affordable to everyday Australians. And they're struggling with that. Because if they have an overdraft or a loan, just like a household, their interest costs on those loan facilities have gone up quite substantially. And many a small business owner in this country also has a mortgage on their home, so they get hit doubly. Yet they're the very people that we want to be successful and prosper, because they are the ones that employ Australians. They are where our innovation occurs. They're where our new ideas occur. They are the people that make stuff that generate wealth for this country. Just like our farmers, just like our miners, our small business community works extraordinarily hard every day, not just to put food on the table for their families, but to put food on the table for every single person they employ. And they generate enormous wealth and opportunity for this country as a result. That is, or they are the things, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we should be speaking about in this place. Yet we stand here debating a bill that is nothing short of a political stunt. As I said before, we've seen NBN prices go up some 14% in the last 12 months. But we also see that their satellite business is failing to keep up with new and more flexible and adaptable entrants such as Starlink. 2 years ago, the NBN had 120,000 satellite customers and Starlink had virtually none Today, NBN has 85,000 satellite customers and Starlink has 270,000. What has the government done about that? Nothing. Over the same time, the NBN brownfield business and existing homes has lost almost 100,000 customers. They're hemorrhaging cash. But this bill does nothing to address those fundamental structural issues in the operation of the NBN. Why are we not here talking about that? How we make the NBN more cost-effective, more effective to provide the genuine service we want the NBN to provide to Australians. And we all want the best internet possible for Australians because we know increasingly we are spending more and more time online. Sadly, that's probably not to the best interests of our community because we spend time talking to each other online rather than face-to-face. And I know, talking to some of my former colleagues in the financial planning industry, it's one of their great bugbears that new employees tend to want to email or text people rather than actually sit down with customers and have a face-to-face discussion. But as I look at this bill and much of the other stuff that this government does, and I say frequently in this place, Deputy Speaker, it's not about listening to what the government says, it's about looking at what they do. Because 9 times out of 10 they are two completely and utterly different things. And as we've seen over the past 2.5 years, it's the Australian people that pay the price. It's the Australian people that pay the price for this government's failure to deliver on their promises and deal with the issues that the Australian people are facing each and every day. And to borrow somebody else's terminology or phraseology, I think it's a fair question to ask, and I have this discussion with people in my electorate all the time. Are you better off today than you were 2.5 years ago? And the simple answer is the Australian people are not, full stop. And this bill, this political stunt, because that's what it is, Mr Deputy Speaker, a pure political stunt, does nothing to assist, improve the lives and livelihoods of the Australian community that is suffering under a Labor-induced cost of living crisis. And we should rightly not support this bill.
I thank the honourable member for Ford. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable minister.
Thank you very much. The bill before House, the National Broadband Network Companies Amendment Bill, will ensure that the NBN Co remains in public hands. It enshrines into law the Albanese Labor government's commitment to retain public ownership of the NBN and prevent the coalition from selling it down the track. And we know they want to. They've said it before. Nothing is off the table when it comes to the coalition funding its expensive and uncosted nuclear power plants for this country. So there's no doubt NBN will be part of that story, and this government will make sure that does not happen. The NBN is vital for Northern Australia, where slow and patchy internet connection restricts the region's ability to reach its full potential in a modern Australia. Many communities in the north are underserved by telecommunications providers due to higher costs and lower population density. It means people in the north sometimes suffer connectivity black spots and network congestion. This government is taking action to address these problems because these problems limit how the people of the north are able to run a business, access education and connect with friends and family around the world. While the most recent Australian Digital Inclusion Index of 2023 shows the difference between states and territories has narrowed, the Northern Territory still ranks the lowest. Now, that is simply not fair, and it must change. The importance of digital connectivity to the Northern Territory and Northern Australia is why the Northern Australia Ministerial Forum has made it a focus issue to address. I re-established the forum to work together with the Queensland, Western Australian and Northern Territory governments to drive social and economic outcomes right across Northern Australia. At our first meeting in 2022 in Darwin, it was agreed that digital connectivity was one of the 14 pillars for achieving the forum's goal of supporting livable, safe and healthy communities in the north. Digital access and affordability has been at the top of the forum's discussions ever since, and we have been taking action. The Albanese government is addressing the forum's concerns by delivering fast, accessible and reliable internet access right across Northern Australia. We're doing that through our $2.4 billion investment in the NBN fibre upgrade program, which includes better services for 236,000 households right across the north. It'll swap slow copper wire with fast fibre cable and give Northern Australians speeds of up to 1 gigabite per second. The Coalition, as we know, brought over 60,000 kilometres of copper, enough to wrap around the planet 1.5 times. A dreadful waste, and shows again how they choose to live in the past. The Albanese Labor government is rolling out a better connectivity plan for regional and rural Australia worth $1.1 billion. It includes $480 million for the NBN fixed wireless and satellite upgrade program to switch 120,000 homes from satellite connectivity to fixed wireless. It will upgrade over 2,300 towers and boost internet speeds up to 100 megabits per second. The Albanese Labor government is also working with remote First Nations communities across Northern Australia to deliver free community Wi-Fi by the end of the year. This is a game-changing program. It's a $20 million program that includes the Gangang community in the Northern Territory, the Kawanyama community in Queensland and the Mindarati community in Western Australia. Free Wi-Fi in these remote communities in the north will boost opportunities for education and jobs and improve access to services and information. The north deserves the same internet speed and access that the rest of the country enjoys, and this government is determined to bridge that digital divide to ensure Northern Australia gets the same digital connection that the rest of Australia expects. The NBN is a nation-building infrastructure and is essential to the health, safety and prosperity of Northern Australians, just as it is for the communities in the south. All across Australia, communities rightly expect and deserve high-speed broadband for our modern digital economy. In my electorate of Brand in Western Australia, families rely on fast internet as a part of their daily lives. We rely on it every single day. Kids need it for their schoolwork or for catching up with friends. Homes need it to run household appliances like solar panels, and of course in my house we need it to be able to stream music and videos. Business depends on the internet for orders, payments management and communication systems. It's integral to modern life. The Albanese Labor government understands how important fast and affordable internet is to Western Australians and the people of Brand. 7 years ago, in 2017, that's a long time ago now, I hosted then Shadow Minister Rowland in crisis talks with residents frustrated with the lack of internet coverage in the suburb of Baldivis. I heard one story of a child having to go to McDonald's to study because it was the only place around with reliable Wi-Fi. I launched an online petition for better internet connection in Brand that received nearly 600 signatures, but the Coalition government at the time refused to fix it. The opposition sat on their hands, but this government is rolling out fast and affordable internet to Baldivis and indeed the whole Brand electorate. The $2.4 billion NBN fibre upgrade program will give an extra 1.5 million households access to full fibre, including 50,000 homes in Brand. It will swap slow copper wire, you know, the stuff that's going to go around the planet 1.5 times. It'll swap that outdated technology with fast fibre cables so the people of Brand can enjoy speeds of up to 1 gigabit per second. We're rolling out fast fibre internet in Brand so more Western Australians can enjoy the benefits of the NBN in the outer suburbs. And the Labor government also launched the School Student Broadband Initiative in February 2023 to provide free internet for 30,000 families across Australia who can't afford home broadband. It's narrowing the digital divide by ensuring that all students can get online at home to do their homework. And it's helping families with the cost of living by saving them thousands of dollars through a free NBN connection. So while the opposition's NBN forced a child in Baldivis to study in McDonald's, the Albanese government is helping every student access fast internet at home. It's an excellent program, and I urge everyone who hasn't seen it and needs it to apply and get involved. It's free internet for your kids to do their schoolwork. The Albanese Labor government is able to deliver upgrades to the NBN because it is in public hands. It means we have the levers we need to plan ahead for the ongoing digital transformation that's sweeping through homes and businesses across Australia. But the NBN isn't safe from privatisation because there's nothing we know that the Coalition won't privatise. And we know that the NBN is certainly on their hit list. The former Coalition government even asked the ACCC to let the NBN significantly increase its prices to fatten up for a sale. The NBN already has a monopoly, and selling it would risk future hikes in prices and drop in services and quality. But the Albanese Labor government will keep the NBN in public ownership to safeguard Australia's long-term economic and security interests. The government started this process in 2022 by issuing an updated statement of expectations that confirmed our strong intent to keep NBN Co in public hands. After a decade of uncertainty under the former Coalition government, Labor has provided the NBN with the assurance it needed to continue improving the network while keeping prices affordable. This bill will give all Australians even more peace of mind by enshrining this commitment in law. This bill makes it clear that keeping the NBN in public hands is non-negotiable. It also removes all provisions in the NBN Companies Act relating to a sale of NBN Co. This will support ongoing upgrades to the network and keep up with rapid technological change. And it will ensure strong regulation of NBN wholesale pricing to keep broadband affordable for all Australians. Labor established the NBN as a secure and reliable digital backbone to provide fast and affordable connectivity for every Australian. And now, after a decade of wasted time from the Coalition, the Albanese Labor government is making that goal a reality. We'll also keep the NBN in public hands so broadband stays fast and affordable and accessible for all Australians, including the people of Brand, right across all the suburbs of Rockingham and Kwinana and all of Western Australia as well. When Labor takes Australia forward, we need to stop the Coalition from trying to take us 5 steps back whenever they get the chance, and that's every single time. And I'm proud of a government that puts people first. We'll put the NBN first so that people can ensure they have the access they need to digital technologies to ensure their future made here, right in Australia.
Order. I thank the Minister. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Nichols.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on the National Broadband Network Companies Amendment Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024. Well, the biggest question about this bill before the House is why? I think it's a ruse. I think it's a distraction. I think with this legislation, the Albanese government is trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. And respected political commentator Chris Uhlmann summed it up as basically a scare campaign dreamt up in a tactics meeting. With a customary flourish, he described the bill in it as, and I quote, a bill to ensure that something that's not likely to happen won't happen. Ziggy Switkowski, former chairman of the NBN and a former executive of Telstra and Optus, had this to say: the decision to hold NBN in government ownership is fine for the short term, say this decade. Beyond that horizon, why do it? It feels like the ban on nuclear power. Why do it? I've asked that question before today. Why do it? Nobody quite got to the nub of the issue, as well as my friend on this side of the House, the member for Fadden. And he made a statement in this place on October the 9th, the week that this was introduced. And he called it one of the greatest political smokescreens to have ever been created in the history of this place. He said, "The NBN bill introduced today is a shameless stunt." The Prime Minister walked out of the chamber at 8 p.m. last night, having given his apology to the Australian people at 7:59, the apology relating to his comments about people with Tourette's. And he thought, well, that didn't go down too well. I suspect he'd been playing Jenga over the weekend and was inspired to be a destructor actor. So the Prime Minister, this is according to the member for Fadden, the Prime Minister picked up the phone to some of his ministers wanting to know, what have you got in the drawer? He phoned his friend, the Minister for Giles first, but he obviously had nothing to offer, Deputy Speaker. He phoned the Minister for Education, but all the Prime Minister got, according to the member for Fadden, was a long-winded story and he had to hang up. He then phoned the Minister for Communications and she said, well, Prime Minister, I've got this sort of Medi-scare kind of thing about the NBN and public ownership and creating a false story about how it might be sold and that sort of thing. And the Prime Minister says, bingo. Now, the National Broadband Network Companies Bill 2010 was introduced by none other than the Prime Minister, who was the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport at the time, our current Prime Minister. And in the second reading speech, he said, these bills enshrine in legislation the policy commitments the government made in its NBN announcement and provide clarity and certainty to NBN Co Limited, industry and the wider community. So, presumably, when the bill passed back in 2010, it cemented that very clarity. So, the bill set out arrangements for the eventual sale of the Commonwealth stake in the company once the NBN rollout is complete, including provisions for independent and parliamentary reviews prior to any privatisation, and for the Parliament to have the final say on the sale. And there was no longer a requirement that NBN Co Limited must be sold within 5 years of it being declared built and fully operational. Rather, the time frame for any sale was to be left to the judgment of the government and Parliament of the day, enabling due regard to the role of the NBN that the NBN is playing, market conditions and any other relevant factors. Deputy Speaker, I was just interested in what some of the then members of the then government said about this NBN bill at the time. Well, let's see. Senator Stephen Conroy made a statement on the 25th of November 2010. He said, the bill also sets out ownership arrangements. The Gillard government remains firmly committed to selling its stake in NBN Co after the network was fully built and operational, subject to market conditions and security considerations. Senator Conroy also said, government committed to sale of NBN Co. Senator Conroy said the Gillard government remained firmly committed to selling its stake in NBN Co after the network was fully built and operational, subject to market conditions and security considerations. Senator Collins said a year later, the bill also creates power for the Governor-General to make regulations concerning future private ownership and control of NBN Co Limited and establishes other relevant reporting, governance and enforcement mechanisms. So the government back then made it clear that the future governments could make decisions and make regulations regarding the future of NBN. So why this sort of yell across, oh, the coalition government wants to sell the NBN, they privatise everything? It was the ministers in the then Gillard government that were talking about selling it. Nobody in this place has been talking about the NBN. The Prime Minister hasn't been talking about it in this term, as far as I can ascertain. He's only mentioned the NBN 6 times in Parliament this year, and no one's been talking about a change to policy on ownership. It seems to me it's the basis of a scare campaign and a distraction, that we will privatise the NBN and drive up prices. Now, this would be worth a bit of a chuckle, Deputy Speaker, if we could just focus on that stunt and shambolic approach of the current government. They rushed to introduce this legislation to head off something that they legislated in 2010. So desperate are they to create political distraction that they are really introducing amendments to their government's own legislation, which they passed in 2010, when our current Prime Minister, as a member for Hume quite rightly reminds us, when he was in Cabinet. Now, the cruel irony is that they're saying they're doing this because of the cost of living crisis that we're experiencing. Now, yeah, they created it and we're feeling it, especially people in rural Australia. Now, inflation. They haven't got inflation under control. The interest rate cuts look like a long way away. There's higher prices for energy, higher prices for food, higher prices for services, for mortgages. Where are the interest rate cuts? Higher prices for rent, and productivity is nosedived. I would have thought that a government that was committed to helping out Australians would be focusing on policies to help those things. The price of food. You help the price of food by helping farmers do their job, not by taking the irrigation water away, killing their export markets and making them pay ridiculous fees like the biosecurity tariff that they have to pay. The cost of living crisis is with us. It's as a result of this government's policies, and all we get from them is a sort of a scare campaign. Look over here, look over here. They're going to privatise the NBN one day. We better change our own legislation that we put together in 2010 to make sure they don't do it. And we're not even in government. Now, NBN costs have actually gone up under the current government. We've seen 6 million families impacted by NBN price rises of up to 14% since October last year. So NBN is one of the many things that's gone up during this government's term. The NBN satellite business is collapsing, and 2 years ago the NBN had more than 120,000 satellite customers and Starlink had virtually none. Today the NBN's down to 85,000 satellite customers and Starlink has more than 270,000. This bill, as I said, is a distraction. We could be talking about many things. We could be talking about how to increase productivity for our businesses. We could be talking about how to better structure IR so that small business, which is the backbone of our economy, isn't smashed by burdensome regulations. We could talk about our agricultural businesses, how we can provide them with more irrigation water to grow the food, to make it cheaper for Australians at the checkout, or for us to continue with our great agricultural exports. We could be talking about all sorts of other things. We could be talking about the cheaper childcare, which they do talk about, but there's so many places in regional Australia where you can't get a place. So it's no good at being cheaper if you can't even access it. It seems to me that the current government's strategy, and I've noticed this in question time over the last couple of weeks, is to call the opposition leader names. Now, when you start to, when I was a kid at school and I was in the schoolyard and you're having a bit of an argument with your mates, even the bullies that are trying to tease you, you knew when they started calling your names that they didn't have a proper argument anymore. So, I can see the Tactics Committee, let's try and get as many references to the arrogance and the recklessness and angriness of the opposition leader. Let's try and get them in every answer to the question. I reckon that symbolises a government that's run out of puff and doesn't have any more policy ideas. Now, I reckon we need to get to an election, hopefully sooner rather than later, so the Australian people can think about all of this. These distractions of policy, these sort of this NBN into the ether. People are being smashed out there in their household budgets, and you've got to help them out. We've got to talk about policy, not just have this sort of this two-stage policy. Let's try and scare everyone in relation to nuclear energy, and let's try and tell everyone. Let's try and paint the picture. Let's try and paint the picture of the opposition leader as angry, as reckless, as arrogant. Let's call him as many names during question time as we can, and that substitutes for real policy that helps get the cost of living down. The disastrous... the NBN is this NBN bill is emblematic of a government that is not focusing on the real concerns of Australia, and a Prime Minister who's looking to distract from his own shortcomings because it came after he made a very unfortunate comment in question time. I think the Australian people want to get back to looking at some real policy, not these sort of distraction stunts. And I invite those opposite to start doing that. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Order. I thank the honourable member for Nichols. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable